Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The vile emperor approves, Bai Xiaochun thought, blinking a few times as his heart began to beat faster in his chest. Poor kid, he doesn't even know that the person he thinks is his father is actually an imposter. His real father disapproved, but once the imposter took over, it was only natural for him to approve of such a harmful inclination. Although he felt bad for the vile prince, he was now in absolutely no mood to participate in some sort of banquet. Furthermore, he was now convinced that just about everyone in Vile Emperor City was crazy. Not a single one seemed like an ordinary person. At the same time, he decided that nothing about the vile prince's speech just now made sense. After all, he didn't want ideas like that to take root inside of him and cause unwanted changes to his psyche. These people are psychos. Bai Xiaochun firmly refused the vile prince's offer again, and then, despite the fact that he knew it would not please him, flew up into the air, along with his two demigod subordinates. Just as he was preparing to leave, he stopped and looked back at the main gate. As he did, the aura of the mid-celestial realm suddenly erupted out from that very spot, shooting out as if to oppose his departure. An unsightly expression overtook his face, and his heart turned icy as he looked at a figure walking out of the darkness of the gate. There, dressed in a black robe, was Taoist Heavenspan. His face was cold and grim as he stared at Bai Xiaochun, and it was almost possible to hear the sound of thunder crackling when their gazes met. There's something strange going on with Taoist Heavenspan. He's much stronger than the last time we met in the second immortal domain. Bai Xiaochun had made rapid progress because of the enormous good fortune he had come across. However, it was clear that Taoist Heavenspan had also encountered some unimaginable good fortune of his own. His cultivation base had risen rapidly, to the point where he was now catching up to Bai Xiaochun. Were he not in Vile Emperor City, Bai Xiaochun would have attacked Taoist Heavenspan without even thinking about it. But now, he could only do something like that if it was absolutely necessary. Now that Taoist Heavenspan had arrived, the vile prince flew up into the air, laughing. Ambassador Bai, there's no need to be in such a rush. If you don't want to make that trade, then fine, we won't trade. Now that you've come all this way, though, you definitely have to enjoy some fine alcohol. I specifically invited you and Taoist Heavenspan here so that I could act as a mediator between the two of you. No matter what, the two of you are both from the Heavenspan realm. There are no enmities that we can't resolve if we try. Come, let's drink together and put the past behind us. We cultivators pursue the eternal, that is the true great Tao. In response to the advice, Taoist Heavenspan clasped hands and bowed deeply at the waist. I'll follow your every word and command, vile prince. To see Taoist Heavenspan acting and speaking in this way caused Bai Xiaochun to frown. After all, Taoist Heavenspan was a celestial, and therefore, there didn't seem to be any reason for him to act in such an ingratiating fashion. Even if Taoist Heavenspan was a foreigner, it still didn't make sense. Furthermore, this didn't seem at all the way that Taoist Heavenspan used to act. He had been the high and mighty celestial at one time, but now he was acting completely differently. It was as if he had changed completely. Looking at him, Bai Xiaochun slowly and forcefully said, "You gave up everything, and even treated your own flesh and blood with the ultimate cruelty, abandoning your own people, just to leave the world you lived in. And now, Taoist Heavenspan, you are nothing more than a dog and a lackey. Are you happy?" Taoist Heavenspan's expression didn't change as he looked up with cold eyes. "I'd rather be a dog with freedom," he said, "than waste away into death in that tomb of a world." He spoke the words with utmost calmness, as though he had already pondered this point at length. Taoist Heavenspan's response only served to anger Bai Xiaochun more. "Maybe you're a dog with freedom," he shot back, "but you watched with your own eyes as your people suffered in torment." "It was survival of the fittest," Taoist Heavenspan replied calmly, as if nothing so far had provoked even the slightest emotional reaction within him. Perhaps for them, it was just the first step. Those who survived are suitable to keep living. Those who died simply faced a cultivation tribulation. For those who were buried in the process, perhaps it was good fortune for them to die with the world around them. "Well said," the vile prince declared, a look of praise on his face as he laughed loudly. "You couldn't have said it better, Celestial Heavenspan. In the cultivation world, survival of the fittest is the most important thing. Ambassador Bai, what point is there in weeping for the weak? People are born, and they die. It's as simple as that." As the vile prince chuckled, Taoist Heavenspan nodded in agreement. Looking at Bai Xiaochun, he smiled. "Bai Xiaochun, you used to be as timid as a mouse, and scared out of your mind of dying. How come you've suddenly become so sentimental? Bai Xiaochun stared dead at Taoist Heavenspan for a long moment, seemingly struggling to control himself. Then he suddenly chuckled. Eyes filling with determination, he said, "You want to fight? Then let's fight." Taking a step forward, he transformed into a series of afterimages that shot toward Taoist Heavenspan. As he neared, Taoist Heavenspan's eyes narrowed, and he performed a double-handed incantation gesture. Instantly, 10 Tao gates appeared behind him, swirling into the form of a tempest that surged forth to meet Bai Xiaochun. They moved with blinding speed, colliding in a massive explosion that sent shockwaves out in all directions. The nearby devas and demigods were visibly shocked, and backed away. Even the vile prince immediately fell back. After all, a battle between two celestials could flatten everything in the area. It was truly a shocking thing. "What are you doing, Bai Xiaochun?" the vile prince shouted, clearly placing all the responsibility on Bai Xiaochun. However, once Bai Xiaochun committed to launching an attack, he didn't care what anyone said or did. He followed through like lightning, and within the blink of an eye, he and Taoist Heavenspan had exchanged dozens of blows. Blood sprayed out of Taoist Heavenspan's mouth as he was sent tumbling backward, his face as white as a sheet, and yet, his eyes defiant. He had goaded Bai Xiaochun into attacking to get a sense of exactly how strong he actually was. The answer he had received was not satisfying. Even as he fell back, Bai Xiaochun accelerated, striking him again. Taoist Heavenspan once again found blood spraying out of his mouth as he was flung backward another 300 meters. Just as Bai Xiaochun's killing intent truly began to rage, streams of divine sense began to converge on the location. The Celestials of Vile Emperor City were preparing to interfere. If it had been just them, it might not have been anything to worry about. But then a divine sense that surpassed any celestials appeared, something vile and domineering, something that could split apart the heavens. Instantly, the divine will grabbed Bai Xiaochun and pushed him back in completely unceremonious fashion. Bai Xiaochun shivered as he staggered backward several dozen meters. At the same time, the voice of the vile emperor rang out coldly in his ears. "That's enough." Taoist Heavenspan immediately bowed his head and said, "Yes, sir." As for Bai Xiaochun, he stood there for a moment with clenched jaw before nodding. Waving his sleeve, he turned and began to walk away. However, after only walking a few steps, he stopped in place, looked over his shoulder and said, "How is Du Lingfei?" Bai Xiaochun had been holding those words in his heart for a long time now. In the past, he hadn't dared to ask them, mostly for fear of what the answer might be. But now, he didn't hesitate. Up to this point, Taoist Heavenspan's expression had remained as cold as ice, even when he was coughing up blood. But in response to Bai Xiaochun's words, he suddenly shivered. He even averted his gaze to avoid revealing the bitterness and other mixed emotions he felt. Although his expression quickly returned to normal, his voice softened just a little bit. "She's alive." "Where?" Bai Xiaochun replied, similarly shivering a bit. A long moment passed. Finally, Taoist Heavenspan said, "I haven't been able to find her." When Bai Xiaochun heard that, not even he was sure of what to think or how to feel. Another moment passed, and then he left, not bothering to ask any more questions. Back at the embassy, he yet again went into seclusion in his private chamber. After sitting down cross-legged, he shivered, and a bitter gleam appeared in his eyes as he recalled what it had been like to have Taoist Heavenspan absorbing him, with Du Lingfei desperately pleading for him to stop. "As long as you're alive, that's all that's important," he murmured. For some reason, not even Taoist Heavenspan had been able to track her down, but Bai Xiaochun knew that as long as she was still alive, he would be able to find her eventually. It was the same with Bai Hao. As long as there was even a tiny bit of hope, he would cling to it. And that beautiful hope enabled him to refrain from sighing about the matter. It's definitely going to happen. Taking a deep breath, he suppressed his thoughts, closed his eyes, and resorted to cultivation to seek peace, something he had once been loath to do. A month flew by in a flash, and Bai Xiaochun focused on cultivation the entire time. Forgetting the bitter pain of the past by immersing himself in cultivation was something he had grown used to. Another month went by. After calculating that the spirit automaton was asleep again, he went back to the damaged fan. He knew that the spot where the fan floated through the inky darkness of the void was far, far away from the eternal immortal domains. Although he wasn't sure exactly where the fan was, he knew that when he stood on it and sent his divine sense out to scan the area, it felt very different from the eternal immortal domains. "Is the void that huge?" he murmured. Not only was he happy to use the fan to improve his cultivation, he was also using it to step through a door of epic proportions. He wasn't sure if anyone before him had ever left the eternal immortal domains in this fashion, but he had the feeling that if people had, they were few and far between. It seemed likely that not even the vile Emperor or Saint Emperor had traveled so far out into the darkness. I wonder if I'm really the only person from the eternal immortal domains to have ever been out here. Finally, he looked away from the void back to the damaged fan. Things are probably going to get even harder after the 78th level. Eyes flashing, he headed toward the fan rib that led to the 79th level. Bai Xiaochun soon found out that the 79th level was even more shockingly difficult than he had imagined. In fact, it took roughly half a month for him to pass it. If it weren't for his tremendous powers of regeneration, and the fact that he had absorbed some flesh and blood from a sovereign, he probably would have failed. And next was the 80th level. Time flew by. In the past, when the spirit automaton had remained in slumber, Bai Xiaochun would have been able to pass 10 levels in that amount of time. But this time, he only got to the 83rd level. Upon emerging, he was clearly spent. He lay down flat on his back, wounds still bleeding, his fleshly body and cultivation base teetering on the brink of collapse. That was too hard, he thought. He lay there for 3 days before he felt recovered enough to do some calculations regarding the spirit automaton. I probably don't have enough time to get through the 84th level, he thought. That little automaton should wake up in 2 or 3 days. Although I could at least check out the level to see what it's like, and maybe start thinking of a way to pass it. Gritting his teeth, he headed toward the 84th level. As soon as he entered and looked around, he saw something that was almost completely unimaginable. His eyes went wide. There's no way this is really happening. Heavens! The world of the 84th level was a bleak wasteland. The sky was dark, and what little vegetation existed was withered and dry. There was also a pervasive aura of death that filled the entire place. Surrounding him in the air were vast numbers of souls. They floated around mindlessly, and apparently, would continue to do so for all eternity as long as no one bothered them. However, if they were disturbed, they would become vicious, and completely intent on gobbling up anything living. Considering the vast number involved, it was only possible to imagine the shocking scene that would play out if that happened. To the cultivators of the eternal immortal domains, souls were not a common thing to see. Although it wasn't completely impossible to encounter them, they were definitely a rarity for people with lower cultivation bases. Bai Xiaochun had long since come to realize that fact. It was one of the reasons why he hadn't been able to replenish his stock of multicolored flame, and by extension, unable to resurrect Bai Hao. Therefore, seeing this many souls collected in one place nearly caused his vision to swim. He was like a poor beggar who had stumbled across a mountain of gold, and was half convinced that he was seeing things. Apparently, his mere presence was a stimulating factor to the nearby souls, who began to awaken from their state of blankness and turn in his direction. Innumerable souls looked over and began to shriek in soundless fashion, causing fluctuations to roll out everywhere and creating a cosmic tempest that filled the entire 84th level. It almost seemed like the world was about to explode. Then the countless souls began to charge madly toward Bai Xiaochun. Heavens, could it really be true? He rubbed his eyes to make sure he was seeing clearly. Then, before any of them could even get close, he blurred into motion toward one of the nearest vengeful souls and grabbed it. Crushing it, he created a one-colored flame. The sight of the one-colored flame immediately filled him with unprecedented levels of excitement. They're not illusory? Heavens! I love this place. He threw his head back and laughed uproariously. As of this moment, he realized that this damaged fan was a wonderful place. Although some of the levels had been difficult, it was now giving him a huge windfall at absolutely no cost. He didn't care if the spirit automaton woke up right now. All he could think about were souls. During his time in the eternal immortal domains, he had watched his reserves of multicolored flame shrinking, to the point where he almost had none left. As a result, he couldn't perform the same amazing spirit enhancements that he could in the past, and in fact, had to be very judicious in their use. Mine. All mine. Don't run. Ha ha ha. Be a good soul now, come over here to Lord Bai. Rich. I've really struck it rich. The excited cries of Bai Xiaochun echoed about in the world. As for the previously vicious souls, although they didn't really possess any level of intelligence, they were soon looking around in complete shock. Never before had anyone challenged this level in such a fashion. From what they could understand on an instinctual level, living people should be afraid of them. But now, Bai Xiaochun was running around tossing soul convergence pills left and right, each resulting detonation of which sucked in vast amounts of souls. If that were all there were to it, it might have been possible to accept. But he was also conjuring flame at the same time. Suddenly, the tables were turned, and the vengeful souls were the terrified ones. Shrieking, they tried to flee Bai Xiaochun's clutches. Be a good little soul. Don't run. Eyes shining, Bai Xiaochun lunged forward. Vengeful souls were used to striking terror into the hearts of living beings. And this world of death that they existed in had been created for that express purpose. But now, Bai Xiaochun had come, the first heavenly necromancer to ever visit this place. With his soul convergence pills, he created a storm the likes of which the damaged fan had never seen, a storm which changed everything. Rumbling booms filled the entire world. During his time in the eternal immortal domains, Bai Xiaochun had drawn upon many of the medicinal pills he had in reserve, but none of his soul convergence pills. As such, he had a huge amount on hand. Back in the wildlands, he had made a point of building up a large stockpile. That way, if he ever encountered vengeful souls in random locations, he would be well equipped to get his hands on them. However, there were virtually no souls floating around in the eternal immortal domains. As a result, his hands had often itched to return to their previous habits. And now, he was completely overwhelmed by excitement and joy. There were just too many souls. This level was definitely a windfall for Bai Xiaochun, providing him with benefits that surpassed any of the rewards from the previous levels. In fact, even if this level didn't have a specific reward at the end, it would still be better than any of the other levels. To him, the vengeful souls he could acquire were the best reward imaginable. Be a good little soul and don't run. Lord Bai is a nice fellow, he won't bully you guys. Eyes shining, he leapt to and fro, tossing out soul convergence pills and then snatching up the soul spheres they formed to toss into his bag of holding. I'm just scooping up the souls. The only thing that disappointed him was that he couldn't collect the souls faster, and that he only had 2 hands. Worried that he might be expelled from the level, he spared no amount of effort to crazily get as many vengeful souls as he could. Stop right there, all of you. Behave, damn it, get back here. Soon, the amount of vengeful souls had been visibly reduced, while those that remained continued to flee in terror. Around the time that Bai Xiaochun had collected about 20 or 30% of the vengeful souls, the spirit automaton finally woke up. As soon as his eyes opened, he realized that Bai Xiaochun was in the middle of challenging a level. Sending some divine sense out, he saw the shocking scene playing out in the 84th level. The spirit automaton was so stunned that he almost didn't dare to believe what he was seeing, and couldn't even react for an extended time. Although he wasn't actually capable of crying in this moment, that was exactly what he wanted to do. Heaven damned Bai Xiaochun, he howled. My souls, my souls, the exalted sovereign shed blood, sweat and tears to master the Tao essence of life and death, and then created those souls from nothing. Heavens, each of those souls contains some of the Tao essence of life and death. They're priceless. Descending into madness, the spirit automaton sent some divine sense out into the level and unhesitatingly used his authority with the damaged fan to try to get Bai Xiaochun out of the level as quickly as possible. Within the world of the level, chaos exploded into being as a massive gravitational force descended from above, wrapped around Bai Xiaochun, and began to drag him forcefully out of the level. Bai Xiaochun instantly started getting nervous. What are you doing, you little automaton? You're cheating. I haven't finished with the level yet. Why are you letting me pass? You're a spirit automaton. Have some respect. How could you possibly surrender right now? Let me go. I want to rely on my own skills to pass this level. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun wasn't in control of his own body. The gravitational force dragged him up into the sky, and the souls drew further and further away. You good-for-nothing little automaton, he shouted in rage. He even drew upon his authority within the damaged fan to try to fight back. Shut up, shut up, shut up. The spirit automaton shouted, not sure of what else to say. As of this point, he and Bai Xiaochun had almost equal levels of authority within the fan, and because of that, Bai Xiaochun managed to force an equilibrium. Then, he started tossing out more pills and collecting up the resulting soul spheres. The spirit automaton was enraged to the point of madness. Despite having just awoken, he decided to put everything on the line and potentially injure himself to teleport Bai Xiaochun out of the level. When Bai Xiaochun finally vanished, the spirit automaton sagged in exhaustion, his divine sense weakened, his mind drained. Although he considered swearing an oath to destroy Bai Xiaochun in the next level, considering how many times he had sworn such oaths, only to have Bai Xiaochun confound him at every turn, he decided that perhaps it wasn't the best thing to do. He's like my arch-nemesis. Filled with grief, and feeling overwhelmed with exhaustion, he immediately went back to sleep. Outside of the level on the damaged fan, Bai Xiaochun reappeared, heart-pounding, expression that of rage. He tried to go back into the level, but just as with the world of the dark concoctors, he was unable to do so. No amount of trying met with even a hint of success. Finally, he simply sighed. That spirit automaton is way too stingy. What's the big deal about a few souls? This fan is eventually going to be mine anyway. If I'm fine with taking some things that belong to me, what is he getting all bent out of shape for? Snorting, he patted his bag of holding and checked to make sure that all of the souls were in place. At that point, his heart surged. It's been a long time since I had so many souls, he thought. Hand fairly itching, he began to conjure some flame. Light flashed as one tongue of multicolored flame after another appeared. The highest he could go at the moment was 15 colored flame, but he did manage to get quite a collection of that. After all, the difficulty level grew much higher after 15 colors, and the process also tended to be much more draining. Although he had acquired a significant number of souls, after some quick calculations, he was fairly certain that he didn't have enough to conjure up to a 22-colored flame. If I get a bit more, maybe I can get to 22 colors. Eyeing the spark-shaped mark on the back of his hand, he took a deep breath and swore that, after he became the true owner of the damaged fan, he would go back and get all of the souls that remained in the 84th level. It took half a month for him to complete his flame conjuring session. At that point, he had a much more sizable collection of multicolored flame in his bag of holding. Feeling quite pleased, he looked around at the fan and decided that he should probably head back to the eternal immortal domains. After a short rest, he did just that. Soon, he materialized back in his private chamber in the embassy in Vile Emperor City. What a rewarding journey. High-spirited and full of mettle, he summoned his demigod subordinates to get a report of what had occurred while he was in seclusion. After dismissing them, he crossed his legs and began to practice cultivation. 7 days passed in the blink of an eye. His cultivation base was back in top shape, and he was just getting ready to go back to the damaged fan when an imperial edict came down from Vile Emperor Palace. Before anyone could even react to it, a sonorous voice echoed out to fill the embassy. The Saint Emperor Dynasty's ambassador Bai is hereby summoned to the palace for an audience with the emperor. All of the cultivators in the embassy were visibly shocked, and looked over to see how Bai Xiaochun would react. Bai Xiaochun was a bit hesitant, and wondered if the vile emperor planned to punish him for the incident with Taoist Heavenspan. There's no way he's that narrow-minded, right? In the end, he decided that it most likely wasn't because of that. After all, he was the ambassador of the entire Saint Emperor dynasty, and wouldn't be punished unless he committed some massive crime. Perhaps things might have been different if he wasn't a celestial, but he was, and thus felt very confident. Well, it's not like I can refuse anyway. Whatever, might as well go check things out. Still feeling slightly uneasy, he took a breath and headed toward the imperial palace on the dragon's skull. After flying out of the embassy, he immediately felt a bit more at ease as he looked around and realized that he wasn't the only person to have been issued an imperial edict. Celestial Virapaksa and the other celestials were also included. Back when powerful experts of the Vile Emperor dynasty had been fighting those from the Saint Emperor dynasty, they had all been working together. But the truth was that, normally speaking, they were always at odds. People noticed Bai Xiaochun, but did little more than look at him before moving along. That also served to put him more at ease. This thing probably isn't about me specifically, he thought. After all, I'm the ambassador from the Saint Emperor dynasty. The Vile Emperor probably just invited me to attend out of formality. Feeling calmer than ever, he flew up to the imperial palace. Upon arriving, he saw a beam of light approaching, within which was a woman. She was beautiful, but cold beyond measure. Most people edged away from her subconsciously, seemingly unwilling to even come into contact with the ghost chi that surrounded her. She was none other than Gongsun Wanner. Because Bai Xiaochun had given her a chunk of the sovereign's flesh back in the second immortal domain, she had acquired a reward that none of the other celestials did. Despite that, she treated Bai Xiaochun as coldly as ever, almost as if she didn't even notice him. Bai Xiaochun had originally planned to call out a greeting, but upon seeing how she was acting, gave an inward harumph. He was really getting convinced that Gongsun Wanner had mental problems. Considering that, he wasn't inclined to pay her any attention, and simply turned to enter the imperial palace. And yet, even as Gongsun Wanner walked past him, he heard an almost undetectably quiet voice in his ear. Be careful. Only those 2 words were spoken, nothing else. And yet, ripples of divine sense could be detected inside the imperial palace in response to them, as though people had noticed. By then, Gongsun Wanner was past Bai Xiaochun and in the imperial palace. He stood in place for a long moment. Moments ago, he had calmed himself down, only to have that calm shattered by Gongsun Wanner's words. And yet, there was no going back now. Steeling himself, he entered the imperial palace. He was in no mood to marvel at the magnificent imperial palace. Feeling the pressure mounting, he entered the main hall to find numerous banquet tables set up, spread with immortal liquor and spirit fruits. There was also a host of handmaidens present to serve the guests. Bai Xiaochun looked around hesitantly at all the tables. He recognized many of the people here. Virapaksa, Gongsun Wanner, Prince Demon, Celestial Deadfall, Taoist Heavenspan. There were also quite a few demigod experts that he had seen before. At the far end of the hall near the dragon throne was the vile prince, who was currently chatting with the cultivators seated near him. When he noticed Bai Xiaochun, he looked over and laughed heartily. "Ambassador Bai, come, sit here with me." He even rose to his feet, walked over, and cordially put his arm over Bai Xiaochun's shoulder to lead him over to the table. Bai Xiaochun cautiously went along. After being seated, he looked over at the vile prince and asked, "What's the occasion, vile prince?" "My father the emperor recently had a cultivation breakthrough, and instructed me to throw a little banquet. I invited all of the officials and officers of the vile emperor dynasty, first to offer their congratulations, and second to, well, Ambassador Bai, most of your time in vile emperor city has been spent in seclusion. You should really spend a bit more time getting to know the cultivators of the vile emperor dynasty." He chuckled a bit, during which time many of the surrounding cultivators turned to look at Bai Xiaochun. The celestial's eyes were cold, and more than one derisive smile could be seen. Clearly, none of them had any desire to conceal the revulsion they felt for Bai Xiaochun. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun realized that this banquet had indeed been set up to target him. And the likely culprit wasn't the vile emperor, but rather, the vile prince. Bai Xiaochun's brow furrowed slightly, but then he relaxed. Laughing heartily, he took a casual swig of some immortal alcohol, and then cast an enigmatic smile in the vile prince's direction. In response, the vile prince's eyes flickered with icy light, and he chuckled again. Apparently, everyone who had been invited was now gathered. It was at this point that divine sense fluctuations spread out that clearly surpassed anything from a celestial. Before any of the shaken guests could react, someone appeared on the dragon throne. He wore a dragon robe and an imperial crown, and despite his expressionless face, looked like some sort of god. He was none other than the vile emperor. Everyone, Bai Xiaochun included, shot to their feet, clasped hands, and bowed. "Greetings, vile emperor," they said in unison. The vile emperor said nothing. Waving his hand dismissively, he closed his eyes, as though nothing present were worthy of attracting his interest. Apparently, there were many people here who were used to the vile emperor, and understood the significance of his action. And many of them began to cast occasional glances in the direction of the vile prince and Bai Xiaochun. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was now feeling more convinced than ever that this was no banquet. No matter what he has planned, I just have to play along. I refuse to believe that I can commit some sort of capital offense while simply enjoying some alcohol. Snorting coldly in his heart, he kept a calm expression on his face. At this point the vile prince rose to his feet, eyes narrowed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smile, "I think it's safe to assume that most of you have at least heard of the new ambassador from the Saint Emperor dynasty, King Heavenspan, Bai Xiaochun." Bai Xiaochun raised his glass of alcohol as protocol required, a faint smile visible on his face. "Thanks to my profound love for my father the emperor, I have been tasked with presiding over today's festivities. Therefore, the first thing I would like to do is give Ambassador Bai a chance to enjoy his first vile emperor dynasty banquet." Everyone looked on as the vile prince gave his little speech, all of them looking very pleased. "Ambassador Bai, worry about the alcohol later. Please, take a moment to enjoy a special kind of dance that has become something of a tradition in recent years." Glancing at Bai Xiaochun out of the corner of his eyes, he began to clap in very soft fashion. Within a moment, soft footfalls could be heard as two groups of women entered from either side of the hall. All of them were beautiful and lithesome. However, there was something awkward about the way they moved, as if they were marionettes. Odd smiles could be seen on their faces. Strangely, each and every smile seemed exactly the same, down to the slightest twist of the lip. Anyone who saw such smiles would find them to be completely bizarre. However, what was even more shocking was their expressions. Within their eyes could be seen profound entreaty, and even despair. These were not female cultivators. Clearly, these were former female cultivators who had been transformed into corpse puppets. And yet, their souls had been ensnared within them, giving expression to their eyes. They were not like the Walking Dead, but rather were being controlled by external forces. And as soon as they reached the center of the hall, they began to perform a graceful dance. Some people might not find it too surprising of a situation. However, as soon as Bai Xiaochun laid eyes on the spectacle, his mind began to spin, and he even began to tremble visibly. Within moments, his eyes were completely bloodshot, and that was because these women were all cultivators from the Heavenspan realm. In fact, 2 of them had been disciples in the river-defying sect who had written love letters to him. Smiling, the vile prince looked over at Bai Xiaochun and said, "Ambassador Bai, don't you just love this opening dance that we've come to enjoy before banquets in the vile emperor dynasty?" The eyes of the many celestials and demigods in the room were all focused dead on Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun was struggling to remain calm. Clearly, the vile prince had set this all up on purpose to provoke him. The celestials were watching him with coldly flickering eyes, and even the vile emperor sat there without saying a word. If he did something rash here, then it would give them a perfect excuse to claim that he was trying to assassinate the emperor, and then possibly execute him as a result. Bai Xiaochun didn't say anything. He held his cup of alcohol, hand trembling slightly. He could sense the contempt of Taoist Heavenspan, the mixed feelings in Gongsun Wan'er, and the cold expressions on the faces of everyone else. He slowly closed his eyes. Strength, he thought. If I were strong enough to fight an Archean, none of them would dare to humiliate me in this way. None of them would dare to tyrannize Heavenspan cultivators like this. Thankfully, his eyes were closed, making his struggle impossible to detect by anyone else. Unfortunately, things weren't over yet. In response to Bai Xiaochun's restraint, the vile prince smiled again, his eyes flickering with contempt. "Don't worry, Ambassador Bai. We've prepared more traditional entertainment for you." He waved his hand to indicate to his followers to begin the next phase of his plan. "You know, we struck it off as friends as soon as we met. Furthermore, you represent the Saint Emperor dynasty. Therefore, I'd like to present you with a gift. It's none other than, he looked over and waved a finger at the dancing corpse puppets. Well, it's the technique used to produce corpse puppets like this. That way, Ambassador Bai, you can go back and make some of your own to enjoy even more. And, yes, I did make all of these corpse puppets myself." Before Bai Xiaochun could open his eyes, 2 cultivators entered the hall and approached the vile prince. After clasping hands in greeting, they waved their sleeves, causing 3 cultivators to tumble out of their bags of holding. They were all in the nascent soul stage and were all unconscious. "Watch carefully, Ambassador Bai. I'll personally make some puppets right now, just for your benefit." The vile prince smiled broadly, but his eyes were as cold as ice. He had set this trap specifically for Bai Xiaochun, who he was convinced was just too stubborn for his own good. If Bai Xiaochun had agreed to trade bodies, he would have talked to his father the emperor to ensure that his stay in the vile emperor dynasty went smoothly and safely. But Bai Xiaochun had refused him. Therefore, the vile prince had determined to take by force what had not been given in trade. Just as Bai Xiaochun had already guessed, if he was even the least bit impulsive in the presence of the vile emperor, it could instantly be turned into an enormous problem. Therefore, the vile prince's intention was to put Bai Xiaochun in a situation where he couldn't hold back from taking action. Chuckling coldly, the vile prince began to create corpse puppets right there in front of everyone. Within moments, anguished screams erupted from the mouths of the cultivators. Shivering, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes. The truth was that he knew he needed to see exactly what was happening. "There's something about this technique you need to pay special attention to, Ambassador Bai. And that is, you must absolutely not let them die in the process. You must torment them in a way that makes them scream bitterly and in anguish, and yet, does not kill them. That way, the final product will be particularly lively." The vile prince smiled as he explained what he was doing. As for the brutal process playing out, it left everyone feeling quite shocked. Bai Xiaochun's hands were clamped onto the arms of his chair, and his eyes were crimson as he felt himself slowly slipping into madness. The brutality on display was worse than someone being skinned alive. Living people were being slowly transformed into corpse puppets, and the vile prince was describing the process in minute detail. And there was more to it. In order to provoke Bai Xiaochun even more, he released the magical seals on the 3 cultivators, allowing them to think and speak as normal. One of the 3 was a middle-aged man who seemed to know Bai Xiaochun. When Bai Xiaochun's eyes locked onto him, the man wailed, "Help me, arch-ancestor. Help me." Gongsun Wan'er's face twitched, and she shook her head warningly at Bai Xiaochun. As for Bai Xiaochun, his hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that they suddenly shattered, sending splinters of wood out in all directions. As that happened, the celestials all looked over at him, energy surging. Bai Xiaochun was so angry that he was losing control. Shivering from the inner pain, he wished that he didn't have such a powerful fleshly body. That way the wood would stab into his palms and possibly help him forget about his inner anguish. Feeling profoundly grim, he rose to his feet. In that same moment, the vile emperor stirred on the dragon throne, and looks of glee appeared in the eyes of Virupaksha and the other celestials as they prepared to attack. And yet, in that very moment, Gongsun Wanner waved her hand, sending 3 streams of black smoke speeding out. As a demigod, the vile prince was powerless to do anything, and furthermore, his attention was fully focused on Bai Xiaochun. Before he could react, the smoke stabbed into the screaming, pleading heaven-span realm cultivators. The 3 of them shivered, and then looks of release could be seen in their eyes as they died. Enough, she said, her voice like a cold, sinister wind that swept through the imperial palace. This is the imperial palace, vile prince. Do your research elsewhere. It sickens me. It was not in Bai Xiaochun's place to do something like she had. But she was a celestial of the vile emperor dynasty, and therefore, any consequences she would face would be trivial at most. You, the vile prince blurted, turning to face her. Everyone else present also looked over in shock, including the celestials, upon whose faces could be seen slight frowns. But in the end, there was little they could say by way of response. The vile emperor opened his eyes and looked over, his expression unreadable. Bai Xiaochun looked at the dead cultivators with faint expressions of relief on their faces. Taking a deep breath, he turned to the vile emperor and clasped hands formally, his face expressionless. Vile emperor, your majesty. I'm afraid I must excuse myself early. With that, he turned to leave. A very grim expression could be seen on the vile prince's face, and his eyes flickered with hidden hatred as he looked at Gongsun Wanner. As of this moment, he had vowed to one day transform her into a celestial-level puppet. And yet, he simply wasn't resigned to letting Bai Xiaochun leave. Rushing forward, he blocked his path. Ambassador Bai, His Majesty the vile emperor hasn't given you leave to depart. The banquet isn't over. How could you possibly leave now? There's a very important matter still on the agenda. Bai Xiaochun looked coldly at the vile prince, the killing intent in his heart growing stronger by the moment. At the same time, the vile prince's heart was trembling with icy rage. Were it not for the fact that the circumstances made it impossible, Bai Xiaochun would have cut this vile prince down where he stood. Instead, he stepped around him and continued on his way out. The eyes of Virupaksha and the other celestials flickered hesitantly as they looked at him, and then over at the vile emperor, who as yet had not spoken or done anything. A cold sweat covered the vile prince's body, born of humiliation and rage. Suddenly, he clapped his hands. In response, a beam of light approached from off in the distance, within which was an old man with a demigod cultivation base. And he wasn't alone. He was dragging someone else along with him. Shockingly, the person being dragged toward them wore imperial robes, although his head hung down, making it impossible to make out his facial features. He did not wear a crown, and yet his robes alone made him spectacularly eye-catching. Arch-Emperor, Bai Xiaochun said hoarsely, stopping in place. For many years, only 2 people in the eternal immortal domains had qualified to wear imperial robes. One was the vile emperor, and the other was the saint emperor. But now, another person existed who held such qualifications. He was a direct descendant of the arch-sovereign, the true and rightful ruler of the imperial dynasty from the Heavenspan realm, the arch-emperor. Back when Bai Xiaochun fought with Taoist Heavenspan, the good fortune from the Gravekeeper bestowed him with the bloodline of the arch-sovereign, and turned him into the new arch-ancestor. In addition to the fact that he had a celestial cultivation base, he was very much like an emperor to the current Heavenspan realm cultivators. However, the Arch-Emperor was the true paragon entity from the Heavenspan realm. The Heavenspan realm had been destroyed, but the Arch-Emperor hadn't perished. He had been captured by the vile Emperor dynasty, tortured for information, and then locked up like an animal in the imperial palace. Now, he was being paraded out for Bai Xiaochun to see. Upon hearing his title being spoken out loud, the dazed Arch-Emperor slowly looked up, and his gaze fell on Bai Xiaochun. And then, he smiled. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.